basics of hacking and security defense strategies long before entering the professional world. Early on, much of his professional focus has been on web security threats like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgeries, which not a lot of people play with, etc. But more recently, he has started researching and working on products to defend against malware-based threats. Kyle helped build and design the first commercial security solution based on deception and misinformation, evolving the concept of honeypot technology from a purely academic endeavor to a realistic intrusion prevention strategy. Do you know Web App Secure, formerly Mykonos?
Yep.
Hey, I actually pronounced it right. He is now working on introducing similar deception techniques as a detection and prevention methodology into the malware space. This guy spoke at B-Side San Francisco, right in front of Dave Chronister, and he's like, we need to send this guy an email and see if we can get him out to St. Louis, because he's got some cool ideas. Please welcome Kyle Adams.
Thanks. Yeah, I got it. All right, so Kyle Adams, Juniper Networks. Just to give you a brief overview, was the chief software architect for Junos Web App Secure, which basically is a device you put in front of your website, puts lots of little honeypots throughout your HTML code. So it's more of a realistic approach to honeypotting. But more recently, I've been working on some of Juniper's new products, which kind of dive into the malware space. So I can't really talk about how we're planning on, building products around malware, but through the research, we've come up with a bunch of really interesting ideas and some interesting points that I'd like to share. So the primary goal of this talk is to show you how you can modify your home machine to stop malware from installing itself on your box. I'll go into detail about how this is possible, but before I do, we kind of have to go through a little bit of background as to the landscape that the malware authors have set up for us. So first off, we're going to talk about analysis, so how AV vendors actually deal with malware. We're going to talk about it from the malware authors side of things, so how are they making money off of this stuff and how are they thinking about the problem. And then kind of how the attackers start to optimize to make sure that they're making more money as the malware or the antivirus vendors start coming up with ways to stop those threats. And they've kind of screwed themselves in that respect, and we'll go into that. So just to give you a little bit more detail, for the analysis lab, we're going to talk about how the AV vendors get malware in the first place, how they analyze those pieces of malware, and how those turn into signatures and get deployed to customers to actually protect people. And then from the attacker's standpoint, or the malware author's standpoint, how are they doing the whole return on investment? They have to spend their time and money to actually generate these malware samples. So how exactly do they make sure they make enough money off of that? And then how they optimize to kind of combat the different strategies the AV vendors are using. And I'm going to give you a hypothetical example of some ransomware and how the attacker kind of sees that and how the AV vendors see that. And then we're going to talk about evasion. And this, again, goes into optimization. And this is kind of the core of why you can inoculate your machine. So how do the malware or the AV vendors get the samples in the first place? Well, they use a whole bunch of different techniques. So one of the best ones out there is to spin up a whole farm of virtual machines running Windows of various versions, and just have those things kind of crawl around the shadiest parts of the internet. And all they're looking for is whenever they hit a website that has a drive-by download or something like that, it's going to drop the piece of malware onto that sandbox. And then the AV vendors can go pick up all those samples and they can start doing their analysis on them. They'll also just go on, all the torrent sites and download as many torrents as they can find, most of which we've found are not actually malware, which is surprising. But there is certainly a lot of malware in torrents. Usenet as well, so all the news groups where people are posting binary files, they'll go grab those. And we see a lot of malware on Usenet. They'll go to malware repository, so anytime an AV vendor discovers a piece of malware, they generally push it up into like VirusTotal or something like that. And VirusTotal will actually give that as a feed to various companies who are willing to pay for it. So you can get a lot of malware samples that way as well. You can set up email traps to just catch all the, the spam and the junk mail coming through, and a lot of them have malware attached. And of course, if you launch a dropper on a machine, the dropper is going to go ahead and pull down more malware onto that system. So you can grab the sample that it pulls down, and that's a new piece of malware you can test. So once they have all of the malware, how exactly do they go about figuring out, well, first off, how do you know it's malware? So if you're downloading a whole bunch of things off torrent, you have to figure out which one of those things are actually malware, because a vast majority won't be. And some of the harder ones to find that require quite a bit of testing. So what they'll do is they'll use a few different tools. One is static file analysis. So this is where you take a tool, you throw the malware into it, and it comes back and deconstructs the executable, gives you information about like the headers in the executable, the different bodies, what kind of instructions they're finding, what API calls they're making into the system, things like that. They'll also use virtual machine sandboxing, which is like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Cuckoo or JoBox or some of the commercial sandboxes out there, but they're basically like Windows environments. They have special agents built in, usually into the kernel, that look at all of the different API calls that are coming out of the malware and kind of just creating a big profile of what's going on. So they'll use that as well. And then kind of the middle ground is code emulation. So it's not about running a whole virtual machine, which is expensive and takes a lot of hardware to pull off. But it's also about like creating an environment that looks like an operating system that can execute the code, but the code can't, like the malware can't do anything because when it tries to manipulate files, it's doing that against a fake implementation of a file system. And that's extremely difficult to build because you have to pretty much cover the entire attack surface of, say, Windows in virtual code. So the process that kind of goes through to get from I have a sample to I have a signature and I want to start blocking it. First, the AV labs will get the sample. They'll analyze it for unique behavior. So is this thing writing a registry key and then adding a file to the system and then rebooting the system? That kind of workflow makes a good signature. You don't necessarily have to execute the malware to see that that's happening. The malware may, make those calls off to write the registry key, then make another call. And so just by inventorying the sequence and the instructions that it's issuing, you can tell kind of what it's going to do. And then you can also look for unique data patterns. So once you know it's a piece of malware, you can go look through the file, try to find unique segments, and then create the signatures off of those. The behavior signatures are far better because if you were to have a data, signature on just the raw data of the binary, the malware authors are going to repack it 1,000 times, and that signature is only valid for the one that they actually wrote it for. So once they've actually got all these signatures and behavior flows and all of that, the next thing they do is they write a signature and distribute it off to all their customers. And they also have to clear out the old signatures because if they didn't, at this point in time, we'd have something like 4 billion malware signatures, and that would take forever for your AV to actually pull down. So from the attacker's standpoint, let's see what the life cycle of their malware is minus antivirus, which would, of course, be the world that they wish they were in. So we start with the malware author doing some research. They're trying to find some exploits they can use against their targets. Then they actually have to build the thing. They have to do a whole lot of testing because when you put a piece of malware out there, you have no idea what operating systems it's going to hit, what kind of connections, what kind of drivers on the box, all the different diversity in those environments. You have to do as much testing as you can because once you put that thing out there, you can't go back. It's out there. You have to start a whole new campaign if you need to make a change. Of course, if it actually does get successfully installed, they can always just remote drop a new copy of it, but you have to get to that point first. And then they'll go ahead and distribute it, and then the infection base just grows forever. So basically in this scenario here, time equals money. The more time that they let this thing go out there, the more money they're going to rake in. But this is where the AV vendors come in and screw up everything for the malware authors. So same kind of story, but once we hit the distribution, let's say one of those web crawlers just happens to stumble across the site that they're distributing this through. So they pick up the sample, they run their analysis, they figure out it's bad, and then they create some signatures and they push those out to all their customers. And in the act of pushing those out to all their customers, the other AV vendors notice, hey, there's a new signature for this piece of malware we've never seen before. Let's go write a signature for that too. And so within, roughly a day, pretty much all the AV vendors, all the competent ones anyway, will have a signature for this new piece of malware. And so now the infection base pretty much grinds to a halt. So the realistic scenario here is it's not time equals money, it's time to detection equals money. So let's look at a theoretical example of Bob, the malware author. So he's going to write some ransomware. And he's got to spend about 20 hours, probably way more than that, but we're just being conservative here. So he's going to spend 20 hours researching his targets. He wants to go after your average computer user. They're running Windows 7 or Windows XP. And he's got to spend another 20 hours or more actually building the ransomware. The beauty of ransomware is it's not exactly hard to build, so probably not too far off from 20 hours. And finally, Bob has to get his malware out there to as many people as possible. And generally, the guy who writes the malware is not as good at knowing how to exploit the end users, at least not as good as the criminal enterprises that have been created to do that for them. So they'll actually use kind of a software as a service model to go out there and pay some guy and say, hey, I'll give you 50 cents for every person you get this piece of malware onto. So Bob is spending his 50 cents per person who gets the malware, and he can roughly get it on about 200 machines per hour. These are all just hypothetical examples. It would be totally different depending on what avenue or what venue he used to actually distribute the malware, how successful it was. But the bottom line is he'll get $300 for every person who gets this malware on their machine and is willing to pay to get their files back. We'll say 10% of his victims actually want, or will pay the money and get their files back. So for every hour that Bob's malware is out there and doesn't get detected, he's making roughly $6,000. It's a lot of money. So if you assume he's out there for 72 hours, minus his time, he's making almost $500,000 from this ransomware campaign. But if we introduce antivirus, then things change quite a bit. So once the antivirus has a signature and it gets out there, Bob's really only going to maybe get it on one client per hour. Most of them are going to be up to date on their AV signatures and are going to not allow that to install. So the equation changes a little bit. Now Bob is still going to make a lot of money in the beginning. He's going to make tons of money before the signature gets published. So if you look at when the signature gets published versus how long it's already been out there, at 6 hours, Bob makes roughly $50,000. At 12 hours, $88,000. At 18 hours, $120,000. And at 24 hours, he's only making $153,000. Just still a lot of money, but if you think about it, for every hour Bob doesn't get detected, it's the difference between $30,000 and $1,700. So there's a lot of motivation for the malware authors to try to figure out how not to get a signature published for their specific piece of malware. And it boils down to, there's a bunch of different ways the malware authors try to accomplish that goal. And the first one is distribution evasion. So you can't analyze something that you can't get, and you can't write a signature if you don't know it's badware. So if they can avoid serving their malware to an antivirus vendor, then they can avoid having them have the opportunity to even analyze it and write that signature. So distribution evasion works basically on the server that's serving out the malware. So if you think about a drive-by download, you generally have like an iframe somewhere that points off to a website. If the user loads the page with the iframe, that website, the malicious one, loads kind of in the background, and that might launch like a Java exploit or a PDF exploit or something like that to actually get code onto your machine and then potentially run it. So what they need to do is kind of filter out who they serve that exploit to. Who do they serve the PDF or the Java exploit to, and who do they actually allow to get that binary sample off the malware server. So some of the strategies that they've used here are don't serve to search engines. Obviously, you're not going to infect a search engine, and it doesn't really help to have your malware published in like Google's primary results because sure enough, an antivirus vendor will find it. Don't serve it to security labs. If you know it's Symantec or McAfee, obviously you don't want to serve it to them. Don't serve to environments you can't exploit. So if you don't even have PDF Reader and I need PDF Reader to actually execute my code on your machine, then I'm not going to serve it to you. There's no point in serving you this exploit that your machine will just ignore. Randomly choose not to serve. This one's not really too accurate, but we see it a lot. They'll just say, hey, random number 1 to 10. If it's under 5, we'll serve you the malware. If not, we won't. They'll only serve to specific countries and IP regions. So if they know they only want to infect US citizens, they'll only serve it to US IPs. And they'll also only serve it to known browsers, so Firefox, Safari, Chrome, all of those, and like versions of those that are actually legitimate. It's pretty hard if you don't go and actually download like Chrome's user agent and throw it into your malware collection tool to actually make it look like one of those browsers. And make sure that the referrer is whitelisted. So if I'm going off to a website and I stick an iframe on there to do a drive-by, I know I put my iframe on like, abc.com or something like that. So if I don't see that referrer when the person loads the page the iframe points to, then I know it's not an actual legit visitor. It's just a spider or it's a research lab trying to just enumerate through all the different domains on the internet. And only serve once per IP. So if I go to this website, I load the iframe, I get the malware, I see something's fishy, like some weird redirects happening in the browser, I might be prompted to go investigate. Well, if I open my my proxy tool to kind of inspect all the traffic, if the malware doesn't get served to me a second time, I look at all the traffic, I'm like, yeah, never mind, this was just like a glitch or something. I didn't actually get malware. But in reality, I did the first time when I wasn't watching. So let's kind of look at the iframe strategy for infecting somebody. So this is kind of your typical obfuscated JavaScript approach to dropping an iframe onto a page. So if an attacker does like a WordPress exploit, they'll go across all the WordPress sites that they can that are vulnerable, and they'll just drop code like this into every page they find. Deobfuscated, it looks like this little bottom section here, pretty obvious. It's just loading with JavaScript and iframe, and they use JavaScript to avoid just static HTTP or HTML crawlers. But the attackers have gotten better. They've added specificity to the way these iframes get constructed. So this is an example of where they're using encryption as a way to hide their code from people who they can't infect. So I had said before, if it's the server that's serving out the malware, they can kind of check to see if you have PDF installed and then maybe not serve the PDF that way. But it's even better if you don't even put the iframe on the page unless they have PDF or Flash or something like that running. So in this case, they're encrypting the payload with some, cheesy encryption algorithm, but the key for the encryption is actually the version of the exploitable plugin that they're trying to target. So if they're trying to target Flash version 12.0.0.44, they'll encrypt it with that as the key, and then only people with that specific version of Flash will have this logic decrypted and actually run on the page. So when the web crawlers go over this site and they don't have that version, all they see get injected is garbage, and there's really nowhere to go from there. So then, of course, there's the server-side aspects. That's all client-side. So on the server, you have, again, don't serve to search engines. Don't serve if it's not in a blacklist or if it's in a whitelist. Make sure it's an exploitable OS and browser, and it's the first time you've loaded the iframe, and that the refer is correct. So that kind of helps prevent the malware labs from even getting the sample in the first place. But the next step is, they are going to get the sample. But some of those web crawlers are extremely good. They look exactly like a normal user environment. And for the malware authors to construct their distribution in such a way as to skip those people would rule out a huge section of potential victims. So they kind of rely on that as a first pass, but the real thing is trying to make sure that if the malware labs do get that sample, how do you prevent them from figuring out it's malware? So this is where we kind of go into sandbox evasion tactics. So again, sandbox being a virtual Windows or something like that with a profiling agent running on it, you detonate the malware inside that virtual machine, you profile everything it does, and there are very obvious indicators that it's probably malware. Like if it, changes Windows registry keys that no application should ever change, that's a pretty dead giveaway that it's a piece of malware. If it deletes itself, that's, obviously malware. So some of the techniques that they'll use to get around that analysis is they'll check the system for various signs that it might be a sandbox. And this will happen right in the beginning of the malware execution before it does anything malicious. So they'll check to see if there's a clock skew on the machine. It's very difficult to keep thousands of sandbox machines up to speed with the time. So even a couple seconds difference might indicate that that's not a real user machine. Whether a debugger is attached, and that's probably one of the most popular checks that we've seen, is where they'll just check to see, is my debugger bit enabled? Meaning somebody has launched me with, a debugger of some sort. And if they see that, maybe they still throw a dialog out, maybe they still try to pretend like they're a legit app, but they won't go ahead and infect the machine. They'll check to see if it's a virtual machine. There's a whole bunch of different ways to check to see if you're running in a virtual machine. The most powerful of which is actually executing assembly instructions that only work in a virtual machine. But we've also seen them check drivers and things like that as well. Also, if there's no internet connection, a lot of malware labs will not give the malware access to the internet when they detonate it. And we actually learned this the hard way. We gave them public access. We did it through our own IP address. We ran like 50 samples through. A few minutes later, we're blocked because we're sending tons and tons of spam across the internet. So you have to be really careful with how you expose these things to the internet. So a lot just won't do it. And if there's no internet connection and you expected somebody to have gotten that malware from downloading a piece of, something from a website, that's a pretty dead giveaway you're not in a real environment. Is it an unexploitable environment? If I only know how to infect Windows 7 and somehow I get launched on a Windows XP machine, I really don't want to do anything because it's not going to work. And then whether sandbox software specifically is detected. So something like Cuckoo, which is an open source sandboxing tool, actually drops artifacts all over the machine in order to accomplish its profiling goal. So the malware will actually look for these artifacts and say, hey, I see the Cuckoo port is open. not going to do anything. And also sleeping. Sleeping's a really interesting one. It's a huge pain. So a lot of malware, you got to think like if you're a malware analysis lab, you have so many machines to test pieces of malware, and there are millions and millions of files you need to test. So realistically, you can't let any given piece of malware run in this environment for very long. So the malware authors have kind of leveraged that and said, well, 30 to 60 seconds is about as long as these guys have to run my samples. So as long as I sleep in the very beginning of my execution for that long, then they're not even going to see anything I'm going to do anyway. They'll reboot the machine, re-image it, and start the next sample, and they won't see all the activity I would have done had they left it running for another 60 seconds. And going along that, all the sandbox vendors have effectively put in code in there to say, hey, if you see a sleep instruction, just go ahead and skip it. So keep executing the code. And then the malware authors go, okay, well, if they're going to skip my sleeps, let's take a date check, then sleep, and then take another date check and see if the delta is what I expect it to be. And if not, don't do anything. So it's kind of an arms race back and forth with all these different strategies for the malware authors to find new ways to detect the sandboxes and the sandboxes to find new ways to hide themselves from the malware. So this is where things really get interesting. So there's a bunch of different ways that the malware is trying to avoid getting detected, and this is going to sound a whole lot like how to write good malware, but it's not that. I'll get to the point as to why all this is useful later. But specificity, basically making sure it's the right environment you want to target. Triggers to kind of make it more difficult to trigger the payload so that the malware analysis labs can't see it. How to do the detection so you can kind of stop yourself from doing anything if you think you're in a bad environment. How you can interrupt the actual framework they're using to do the testing. And then dialogs, which are in a whole class of their own and quite amusing, so I'll go through those when we get to that. Any given piece of malware can be doing one or more of these things or none of them. We see roughly maybe 20 to 30% of the samples we come across are doing some form of evasion from sandboxing. But of course, that number is totally skewed because the samples that do sandbox evasion are the ones that are hardest to find, and we're less likely to stumble across them. So it could be, upwards of 50, 60%. We have no idea. So when we talk about specificity, so again, this is in the context of the malware actually executing on the Windows environment. So this is live code running in a live operating system. Check to see if it has an internet connection. Check to see if it has the right software versions. So if I'm going to go exploit Outlook, I need to make sure Outlook is actually on that box. It has the correct OS and the correct, the version of that OS. It has the expected security policies, and this is a big one. So in a malware sandbox, you really want to open the system up as much as possible because when the malware executes, you don't want the actual things in the operating system to stop it from working. So the Windows firewall, for example, you probably want to disable that. Universal access control, that thing that pops up the dialog saying, hey, do you really want to do this in administrator mode? They probably want to disable that too, because it's really hard to automate clicking through those things. So if the malware looks at the security policies and sees, hey, you have UAC disabled and you're running Windows 7, that's really not normal, so we're probably not going to execute on your box. Then to see if the public IP is in the right geographical region, so they'll just ping, some website that returns the IP address. They'll look to make sure it's the right geography, and if it's not, won't do anything. Make sure the clock skew is minimal, and then also making sure that there's actual signs of life on the operating system. So is their Gmail accounts registered? Do they have, chat programs installed? Are their credentials stored in those chat programs? They don't necessarily care if they can go, grab your Gtalk credentials or something like that. They care more that you actually have them on there in the first place. Because again, it's very hard for somebody to set up a sandbox that has all these different accounts and keep them up to date. So let's look at some examples of specificity. Now I could have shown you code as to how they were actually doing this, but I think the dialogues are a little bit more interesting. So in this first example, we have an application that wanted to install into the default mail program. It didn't find one, so it asked the user to go add the default mail program to their list of default mail programs. Another one is requiring the .NET framework, and we've actually seen some that require really obscure versions of the .NET framework that were out for like a week and not really out there anymore. Generally, a lot of those are just fake error messages. The thing is actually infecting your box, but it's giving you some error to make you think it didn't work. But in this case, it actually did require framework 3.5. It requires an internet connection. Again, pretty obvious. This one is really weird. So this is a relatively new piece of malware that only runs on Windows 95 and 98. Not really sure who that's targeted at. So all right, let's talk about triggers. This is probably the hardest thing for us to deal with in the sandbox evasion. And so this would be, again, sleeping for several minutes. That one's not too hard to get around. Requiring multiple executions, that's kind of annoying. So if you have a piece of malware and you launch it, and all it does is say, hey, you know, go launch me again. An analysis framework's not going to know to do that, and it's not going to double execute a piece of malware for no reason. So when that happens, it pretty much does nothing the first time it runs, maybe marks the registry or creates a mutex to say, hey, this thing has run at some point, and then the second time it runs and sees that sign, it goes ahead and executes the payload. We don't see it too often, but it's definitely there. Waiting for multiple reboots. I don't know if you know this, but there's over 50 ways to auto-start an application on Windows. 50 plus ways in the registry alone. So some of those are really kind of buried deep in there, and some of them are actually like, auto-run this piece of code, but not the next time we reboot, but the reboot after that one, and then maybe even the reboot after that one. You can even set up services to be like, if it reboots in the middle of the night, I want to do something, but not any other time during the day. So reboots get annoying. And then the really hard ones are the different events that they expect legitimate users to invoke at some point in time, but maybe not necessarily right away. So they'll put things like default handlers for certain types of documents on the system, so like a text file. They'll put a handler on that, you know, instead of running Notepad, I want you to run this piece of malware that's actually going to do the payload. But you'll never see that happen until somebody double-clicks a text file. And they get a lot crazier than that, so, you know, wait till the user launches a browser. That one's pretty well covered by sandboxes. Wait till the user switches to battery power. I can tell you right now there is no sandbox testing for that specific trigger. You might wait until Windows updates the next time. You might wait until they install new software. You might wait until they connect to Wi-Fi. Again, these are things that generally don't happen in a very well-controlled sandbox environment. It'd be very difficult to have a whole bunch of virtual machines connecting to a real Wi-Fi network and then disconnecting and reconnecting. It'd be a lot of orchestration to set up, and it's probably not that many samples out there that are doing it. But you know, they're all doing different combinations of these things. So even if you did somehow reproduce that specific event, you'd only catch a couple more samples. And then the most popular is the HID activity. So do I see your mouse moving? Do I see you clicking buttons, typing in the keyboard? Do you have a webcam connected? Is there motion on the webcam? Do I hear sounds through your mic? Things like that. So here's some examples of some dialogues that kind of hinted towards us that they were doing some sort of triggering. So in this first one, we have the application basically telling us we need to restart the browser. So it must have installed a plugin or something like that, and unless the browser closes and then reopens, the payload will never actually get triggered. A lot of the sandboxes will launch the malware, wait a few seconds, launch Internet Explorer to hopefully catch some of this stuff, but you know, what if they're installing into Chrome, or what if their plugin doesn't do anything for the first 3 times you restart the browser? It can get quite complicated. This further one down, seems like a terrible way to do this, but basically the first time you run it, it pops open a text document saying, hey, the pre-install check worked. You can go ahead and launch it again, and next time we'll do something. So, I mean, this is a terrible user experience. I don't know who would write software like this legitimately, but obviously this is a piece of malware, so who cares? But if you ever see something like that as a normal user, some red flags should get raised. So the next one is detection. So let's say we're talking about debugger hooks. So things like soft ice and stuff. Actually, soft ice isn't so much a problem here, but some of the debuggers out there, if you connect them to the process, they'll set a bit saying that they're connected, and the application has a nice API call it can make, hey, am I being debugged? A lot of the sandboxes have now figured out you can go flip that bit after you attach the debugger with the debugger so that, you know, when it checks to see if it's being debugged, it doesn't come back and say that it is. But there are still other ways that they can run certain patterns of code to figure out if a debugger is hooked on there. They'll also check for signs of virtual machines, and this is almost impossible to cover up. There are so many signs that you're running in a virtual machine. Take like VirtualBox, for example. If you go into the registry and search for the term VirtualBox inside of a VirtualBox image, you'll see it shows up hundreds and hundreds of times. And you look at the driver list, it's in there a bunch of times. You look at the INI files in the system, it's all over there. There's EXEs all over the place. There's the guest edition. So there's just so much going on in the operating system that's tied to the virtualization platform that it's easy pickings for the malware authors to just go look for all that stuff. Now, that's probably going to change going forward. A lot more things are being virtualized. A lot more desktops or, thin clients that are loading up the desktop off of a virtual server. So right now, it's not too much of a problem if they're ruling out everybody running a virtual machine, but you figure 10 years down the road, that's not really going to be a viable option anymore. So good news for us, hopefully this will get easier. And so we've also seen, again, processes, services, drivers, open ports. So for example, Cuckoo has to open a port to receive samples from an outside controller. It also has to run a MongoDB instance on the operating system. So both of those create evidence on the machine based on the open ports, what's running. And then you'd have like the VM-specific assembly instructions that you could check for. So you just run that assembly instruction and see if things blow up or if they actually work. And then genuine windows. So this is a really strange one. We haven't actually seen any examples, but I have to believe that they're doing this. It's very difficult to keep thousands of Windows installs that are all running and rebooting all the time to never have the Windows activation check kick off, especially since they're effectively all clones. So if the malware sees that it's not a genuine version of Windows, it probably isn't going to do anything. And then, of course, the open ports, processes, and files for the actual Sandbox software. So here's some examples of where we saw that happening. The first one is really interesting. So this is Themida. It's a legitimate application designed to wrap games and other sensitive applications to prevent people from reverse engineering those games, figuring out how to write cheats for the games, and basically, nobody wants their game reverse engineered. So Themida has this product you can go buy. It's all commercial. You wrap your application in it, you push your application out, and it automatically gets virtual machine detection, sandbox detection, debugger detection, all of that. So not surprising, the malware authors have cracked a copy of that, and they're just using it to wrap their own software. So this one specifically came up and said, hey, sorry, we can't run it a virtual machine. And this is all just Themida doing its job. And we never really get to see what the malware is doing because Themida won't even decrypt and drop the actual application until it passes all of these checks. The next one, I really like this one. This is where it detected a debugger. So the dialog comes up and says, debugger detected, please close it down and restart. And then they go so far as saying, for some debuggers, such as soft ice, you must restart the machine without enabling to run the application. Now, who here would use soft ice and not know how to turn it off? Probably no one. So I'm not really sure, and really it's not likely to be on any user's machine in the first place. If they were writing this malware, they should have said, hey, there's a debugger attached. Let's not do anything, not even throw a dialog or just throw a fake error message. But no, they're actually giving instructions on how to successfully run the malware on the box. And then the last one is saying, hey, there's no print driver. I'm not going to install, which of course is weird because how many applications don't install if there's no print driver? So the next one is interruption. And we're seeing cases of this slowly start to come in. They weren't as popular, but now we're seeing it a bit more. So this is where the malware authors are crafting the payload of the malware to actually break the analysis framework that you're using to test the software. So for example, the easiest one is they just cycled a machine, before doing anything bad on it. And long ago, that probably was an issue because a lot of the sandboxes, if you cycled them, might have started analyzing the next piece of malware and just kind of threw away everything before. But now they're usually not only allowing the reboots, but they may actually be triggering the reboot just to see what happens when the system comes back online. But the more annoying side of that is when they log the user out. So instead of rebooting the machine, which would cause it to come back in and get right past the login dialog because you're saying it's the default account, login's not required, it'll go straight back in, continue the analysis. But if they log you out, it'll just throw up, the Windows login screen with little buttons saying, hey, log back in. No password required or anything. You just click the button and you're back in the operating system. But from the testing standpoint, every process on the machine was terminated when they logged out, meaning your sandbox software may have been killed off and wouldn't even be able to respond to the login dialog. So logging the user out seems to be becoming more popular, and it's quite annoying. Another one that is really weird, and we've only seen it once, is where they've actually enabled the firewall on Windows. So, you keep it disabled so that they can freely communicate with the internet, but they'll go ahead and re-enable the firewall and then whitelist the CNC server they want to go talk to. So what this does is it prevents the agent running inside the operating system from reporting back to the analysis lab, hey, I'm seeing this thing doing all kinds of crazy stuff, but letting the malware go ahead and communicate with its CNC server, drop new threats, and do whatever it needs to do. And theoretically, once it's all done, it could reboot the machine, take off the firewall again, and you missed all that activity. And then screen capture automation. So one of the keys here is we need to look at the screenshots that are coming up from this software. So we can kind of tell, does this look legitimate? Do we need to dig into it a bit more? Is this dialog using some sort of weird CAPTCHA interface to try to prevent us from getting around it? All of those different things that they might do with dialogs to evade us, we need to see that. So what they'll do is they'll open dialogs minimize sometimes. They'll open other applications maximize. So we've seen a lot of them. They'll launch their application, then before showing any sort of dialog, they'll launch Internet Explorer maximized. And that blocks out every other window on the desktop, and we can't actually see what's going on. Now we can, of course, go back in there, manually execute the thing, minimize Internet Explorer, and see what it is, but you got to realize all this stuff has to scale. You've got thousands and thousands of samples you have to test every day. So it's important that this thing is fast, automated, and that nobody really has to sit behind it and figure out what's going on. Another one is they'll put flashing components and animations. They'll have little movies that play, and maybe you have to click like a certain piece of the movie at a certain time. That's all pretty much impossible to cover. You might wonder why we don't just take screenshots every time something changes on the screen. Well, it's because of things like animations. If you took a screenshot every time a pixel changed, you'd be taking thousands of screenshots for just a little animation, filling up your disk and not really getting anything out of it. So animations and flashing stuff, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment, and then hidden mouse over components. So they might have a big dialog that's relatively blank until you mouse over it, and then suddenly some interface appears, which, to somebody who's experienced with software would know that's a weird sign, but, everybody else just going to see that and go, oh, that's weird, click. So here's a couple examples of where that's going on. So the first one is where we have the thing forcing a reboot. And this one is really strange. I'm not sure how many of you have ever installed software and had the system reboot on you without asking. Just bam, system reboots on you. And that's supposedly normal behavior for the application. So this one actually throws a dialog like some sort of weird memory instruction violation. And then it says it's going to terminate Windows automatically. And even if you don't click the OK button, a few seconds later, the system reboots. And there really aren't too many cases in Windows where that's actually needed. If you kill like CSV host, sometimes that'll force a Windows reboot, but it'll give you like 15 minutes to clean up your work. In this case, I've never, ever seen a memory access violation cause the system to reboot with a nice, pretty dialog. And then the bottom one, this is a kind of a fake Macromedia flash player. And we got lucky because we took the screenshot while that play button was actually visible. But if you look at when we actually ran this sample, because the dialog looks strange, we wanted to see what it was doing, the play button actually flashes. So had we taken the screenshot a quarter second later, we may not have seen anything. It would have just been a gray box. So that's pretty much that. Now we're going to talk about some of the more interesting dialogues and how they actually play into the exploitation process and kind of social engineering. These were just some humorous ones that we stumbled across. We got Dancing Hillary and Browse Fox, browse the web quick like a fox. So why would you use a dialog in the first place? Well, first off, they're fake apps, fake installers, fake error messages. They're just showing you something's going on. And it's important that they do that because it looks really weird when you download an executable, run it, and nothing happens. You might run it again, but if nothing continues to happen, your red flags are starting to go up. So they'll do it to also prevent sandbox analysis. So if you put a dialog up there and it says click OK to install this application, unless the sandbox software knows how to navigate dialogs, that dialog is going to sit there, the malware is not going to do anything, and you're going to think it's goodware. So a lot of the sandboxes now have instructions to go in there, kind of iterate through all the windows, figure out where the buttons are, what the labels of those buttons are. If it sees like a button with the OK label, it'll go ahead and click it. And we've actually seen cases where people will switch the OK and cancel buttons. They'll be like, hey, we're not really going to install this software. Are you OK with that? And if you click cancel, it'll go ahead and install the software. So they do all kinds of crazy things like that. They'll also fish for information, like, hey, this application won't work unless you give me your Facebook credentials, which these days is not too strange. Like, a lot of apps actually ask for your Facebook credentials as a way to authenticate you. But there's nothing stopping them from just sending those credentials off to their own server and not really using Facebook to do any of the validation. And also to legitimize things, if it looks real, it's probably safe from most people's standpoints. And especially if you're going to start prompting UAC dialogues or firewall notices or anything that would look weird to the user unless they expected it to happen. Just popping up a dialog and saying, hey, I need to go, install some drivers somewhere. This is going to just prompt the UAC dialog. Just go ahead and click OK. We'll be all fine. That's enough to convince most users, to go ahead and click that dialog without really asking any questions. So kind of some examples of where they were using this to kind of deceive the user. The first one is where they're trying to legitimize the UAC dialog they're about to pop open. So it's basically saying, hey, if you're running this web compiler presentation for the first time on this system, you need admin privileges or you're going to get some sort of runtime error. Interestingly enough, you click OK, it doesn't give you a runtime error, it just prompts the UAC, you click OK, and you're good to go. The bottom ones are fake error messages. So the first one is error while loading DLL. The second one is nothing is not a valid integer. These are not really error messages. These are just dialogues people threw up that look like error messages. In reality, the malware did all of its payload way before these dialogues popped open. So really, it's just trying to convince the user, you know, it's not an executable that you're running and doing nothing. It's an executable that you're running and has an error. So you better go download it again or find a different piece of software that'll work. It's less likely to raise flags. You're less likely to report it. So some of the more advanced ones, so as I was saying, most of the sandboxes, we'll talk about Cuckoo, for example, has a Python script that enumerates all the windows, open windows, finds the buttons, the labels, all of that. So some of the malware authors have created workflows that are impossible to automate. So here's an example of one. It says, thank you for downloading Site Update Monitor, whatever that is. And it requires that you go to a website, fill out a little form, it gives you back a code, you have to go back into this application, put the code in, click activate, and now the thing installs. Well, there's really no way to automate that. It requires somebody manually going through those steps. I mean, if you knew it was going to happen, you could automate it, but there's so many different ways they could be doing this that you can't create a blanket case. So they'll also do like TOS acceptance. You know, you have to check a box to say I agree. Sometimes those check boxes can get pretty wonky. They'll put like 6 or 7 of them on there, like I agree, I do not agree. Like, it gets weird. Combination locks we see a lot, and it's where they just basically put up a whole bunch of buttons and say, you know, click on number 5, and then we'll go ahead and install. And again, for the automation script, it doesn't know the difference between 1 through 7. Like, it's just going to click the first one, the second one, the third one. But as soon as they see you don't click, you know, 5 first, they don't do anything. And then we see a lot of graphic-based dialogues. And this is kind of a response to getting around the automated scripts of like Cuckoo, where it's going in there and trying to find the OK buttons and things like that. Well, they'll actually just put a screenshot of what a dialogue would look like. And that way there's nothing to enumerate over. You can't find the windows, you can't find the buttons because it's not a real button, it's not a real window. So those kind of put you dead in the water, but to the user they look exactly the same. Go ahead and click on it. So yeah, I mean, we see a lot of the fake installers, but pretty much all the malware we look at is masquerading as some sort of application with an installer of some sort. We see a lot of fake antivirus installers and things like that. Did that answer your question? So here's a couple examples of some dialogues that are using the more advanced tactics to prevent the sandbox analysis. And it's important to realize the malware authors want users to install this stuff. So the more of this they do, the less people are actually going to get infected. So we don't see it too often. This one, pretty common though, where you get a zip file off the internet or some installer and it's asking you for a password. The password was probably listed right next to the download URL, but once that goes into malware land, into virus total, somebody gets it down from a feed, that password is long gone, nobody knows what it is, you can't really analyze the sample anymore. So the middle one is kind of that combination lock. This one's saying click on, I think, like button number 3 or something like that, and it won't do anything unless you do. And then the bottom one is a fake dialogue where they just used a screenshot. And you can tell it's fake because it's got this little like rainbow border around the inside. I have to believe the malware author had some crazy theme installed on their operating system. It was like, yeah, this looks like a normal window. People won't see anything strange. So bottom line here is, why don't we all become sandboxes? If the malware authors are trying so hard not to get run in a sandbox environment, why not make your desktop a sandbox environment? You can rule out a whole lot of samples from, first off, even getting on your system, and second of all, even trying to run a payload on your system. So how does that kind of look? So we've got two strategies for trying to use deception to not get infected. First one is distribution deception. How can we look like a malware lab trying to download malware samples through our everyday internet browsing activity? And the second one is sandbox deception, is when that malware does eventually get onto our system and it runs, how do we make it think that we're inside of a sandbox and that it's being analyzed, and if it does anything bad, it's going to get detected and have a signature published. So the easiest one is distribution evasion. It has the least potential to kind of mess with your overall daily activities. So the first one, pretend you're Googlebot. just go download user agent switcher, or go modify about config or whatever browser you happen to be using. There's always a way to change the refer. And just set it to googlebot-image, googlebot in parentheses. There's a whole lot of other different user agents you can use, but the idea is use a spider user agent, because those are generally not going to get served malware. It also works great for preventing like lots of weird redirects and affiliate programs and all of that stuff, because they generally don't run that stuff on spiders because it pollutes the search results. Pretend that you don't have any plugins installed, so go ahead and deactivate, Flash, Adobe, all of those things, or just put them to ask to activate from the browser standpoint. When it tries to launch one, it looks like it's not installed or not activated. And disable refers, which has the biggest potential to mess with sites. Generally, most legitimate sites, this is not a problem for. If you get kind of into the shadier areas of the internet, then refers start to become a problem. But you can just go ahead into your settings and disable refers entirely, and now wherever you go, they can't trace back where you came from. This doesn't exist yet, but I thought it'd be kind of a cool project for somebody if they've got some free time. So this kind of exploits the serve only once per given IP. So you just have a little plugin in the browser that says, hey, I see an iframe on the page. Let's go ahead and request the content. If it has any sort of embedded media that could be an exploit, request the page again. And then if that thing that comes back still has the media or whatever, then go ahead and serve it. If it doesn't have the media, great, go ahead and serve it. But anybody who's not serving twice to the same IP will basically sanitize that iframe so that that user doesn't get infected. And if it didn't have Flash or something in the first place, you can just go ahead and serve it. And I'm just going to run through these real quick because we're getting to the end. Permanent debugger, you can go ahead and install a debugger in your operating system to debug every single process you have. You can spoof VMware artifacts. Go ahead and install the VMware guest editions even though you're not running VMware. Just create processes with the same names and launch them and leave them running. You can skew your clock back a year and see what happens that way. And you can also do things like emulate the artifacts. So you can open up the ports Cuckoo uses, or hell, just install the whole Cuckoo guest on your operating system, just so long as you cripple the agent so that it can't actually install a piece of malware. And create DLLs and set your product keys to the same ones the sandboxes are using. The practicality of all this is it requires a bit of complex skill and some engineering and innovation, so it's not super easy. Ideally, somebody would go ahead and create a package you could install on your operating system, keep it up to date, things like that. And the perceived efficacy is with just those 5 strategies that I covered, we were able to see a 20% drop in successful malware installation. So even though, so basically 20% of the samples we were even able to detect in the first place, so there's probably a lot more, 20% of them didn't work. And so the real efficacy of this thing's hard to say, but it's 20% or better, probably quite a bit better. And the benefit is that these are the samples your AV is the most unlikely to catch. So this is adding extra protection incremental to what your AV is already giving you. So that's pretty much it. I've got some contact information on here. In Juniper's Security and Mobility Now, all the slides are posted already. So if you want to go on there and grab a copy to use as a reference, feel free. All right. Anybody have any questions? All right.
Thank you, Kyle. He's